Namaste and greetings. I, Khwahish Kadian, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #WebPolicy Talk. Today we are gathered for a panel discussion on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, implications for India and emerging geopolitics, which is a part of the State of International Affairs #Diplomacy Dialogue series. This event is organized by IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our invitees for the discussion. Chairing the panel discussion is Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, retired IFS, former ambassador to Jordan, Libya, and Malta, former Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of India, Moscow. We welcome you, sir. Moving team panelists with us, Professor Sidhu, Medical Professor and Affairs New York Editorial, Major Dr. Chakravorty, strategic thinker on security issues. We also extend a warm welcome to K. Arun, senior journalist and columnist. We are pleased joined by His Excellency Freddy Svane, Ambassador, Royal Danish Embassy in New Delhi. Our moderator is Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director, IMPRI. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Khwahish, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very important discussion on Russia's special military operation into the sovereign territory of Ukraine, its implications on geopolitics and India. We are joined by distinguished experts who have been closely following the state of current affairs. Today marks the 19th day of Russia's invasion on Ukraine and has been purported to be the most dangerous international conflict since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Several political leaders, observers, and others have raised concerns of escalation to a broader war with NATO allies that could possibly involve nuclear weapons. While such a war is far from inevitable, the possibility of the current conflict spiraling beyond the immediate theater of hostilities is real. Thus, understanding its root causes, what all is at stake for Ukraine, Russia, India, and rest of the world, and what might happen next is essential if we are to prevent the war from getting further worse, and instead of finding a way to bring it to a close. It is therefore very important, and which is why today, under the guidance of Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, we are having this panel discussion with distinguished experts. Thank you all for tuning in and get ready for an in-depth discussion. I now welcome Ambassador Trigunayat to share his opening remarks and invite the panelists thereafter. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. Thank you, IMPRI, for organizing this very timely and topical webinar on a challenge that everybody is facing, the whole world is facing. No single country is immune from its impact and its effect. I'm so grateful to you for allowing me to moderate this session, as such distinguished panelists are there. So therefore, I would not take much time. And His Excellency, my dear friend, Ambassador Freddy Svane, has also joined. So he'll bring us a European perspective. We have Professor Dr. Sidhu, who can tell us how the Americans are thinking, since he's sitting in New York. And of course, General Chakravorty and Mr. Arun, both are very distinguished strategists. So one can tell us about the military dimension, how the other side of India thinks. Perhaps Mr. Arun can dwell on that. To begin with, I would like to just say first word, and that is, wars are evil. There is absolutely no denying the fact. No war has ever brought peace and prosperity to any country, starting from plunder to whatever purpose, objective any country may have. Diplomacy and dialogue are the only way in which today the world can live. But then we have seen the superpowers have their own dynamic, always. We had seen what happened during the Cold War. We have seen that there have been regime change agendas. We have also witnessed, and having myself there and seen in different parts, when Iraq was invaded, when Libya was bombed, when Yemen, Syria, that is still happening. But no one in the world actually thought in recent times that there could be a war in Europe. That was something people thought, but First World War, World War I is over, World War II is over, both started and actually finished there in Europe, to a great degree of destruction for all the countries in the region. Russia itself, which used to be Soviet Union at the time, Second World War, lost 26 million people, one from every household. And the Soviets, at that time, Ukraine was part of it, and have also equally suffered. And therefore, war has never solved any problem for any time. It may be just temporary. So what we are witnessing today is that is happening. On the other hand, we are also seeing that it is not a war between Moscow and Kyiv. It is the war, it's a geopolitics at play. And as I say, the geopolitics at its worst. This has been, in my view, a conflict for geopolitical and geoeconomic competition between the two superpowers. One hyperpower, the other is a superpower. Another thing that we are seeing is this is the first full-fledged hybrid warfare that is taking place in the world today. And it will change the way the world is looked at. The change way that we are going to actually see after this war is actually over, that how the new equations will emerge. Hopefully, there will be no further escalation beyond this localized warfare. That is the biggest threat to the world, because if that happens, then we are into a very different kind of a dynamic, and no one wants that. I hope Russians don't want that, and hope Europeans and Americans don't want that. Then the wars, as we have seen from the history of the previous world wars, they have happened on a very small pretext. Sometimes by design, sometimes by default, sometimes by just a small incendiary light that inflates them. And so therefore, it is an important thing that all the countries in the world must try and resolve this crisis to the extent possible. There are many things, and I'm quite sure the experts will speak about the nuances of this. I won't take much time because Ambassador Svane has to also leave. One thing I would like to say is that very often we are hearing India's vote in the United Nations Security Council. A lot of people are discussing and debating it. I look at it differently. I'm not looking at it from the point of view of India's special and privileged strategic partnership with Russia, its dependencies with Russia or the erstwhile Soviet Union in United. Looking at India's global comprehensive strategic partnership with United States, nor am I looking at it from the point of view that Ukraine, through its history, has never supported India on anything. What I'm looking at it from where India stands. I think that India's vote was the most sensible vote. It was in keeping with its history, its philosophy, and its adherence to the UN Charter, as well as to the dialogue and diplomacy. Very often one considers abstention as neutrality. That is far from truth. If that was the case, then India would not have continued it after some time. But India continues on the matter of principle because it knows for sure that by accusing A side or B side or siding with the another side, it is not going to serve the purpose neither of the peace nor of the humanity. When it asked, it clearly, if you were to read the statement that came out of India explaining its vote at the UN Security Council, it very clearly spoke about the plight of the ordinary Ukrainians who were facing it, or for that matter, anybody who's dying in this war. Secondly, it also talked about the respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity. India has never, in its history, modern history, has never supported external military intervention, whether it was by the United States or whether it is by Russians. It has always, overtly or covertly, has always told the powers that they're wrong and the dialogue and diplomacy should be there. So it has done that. Prime Minister Modi has spoken to 11 leaders, including the Quad leaders, and explained India's position and told that direct dialogue should happen. Of course, India's biggest interest in this, and for any country that would be, was its own citizens, 20,000 odd citizens who were there. That was your primary concern. And I have been in Libya and how we had evacuated Indians during that period. I know it, how difficult it is. And if you take a side, what do? You expose one or the other for nothing. And you are gaining nothing. The cause of peace is not gaining. Cause of diplomacy is not gaining, because both sides are standing eye to eye, eyeball to eyeball, not willing to blink. They did not give chance to diplomacy when the time was there. And when the time is up, then we cannot accuse, because that does not serve any purpose. It only history books will be written who's right, who's wrong. But hopefully there will be some way, and there is a little hope coming out of the discussions by the several countries are trying to do that. How I look at the geopolitics, I look at it now that, in my view, I think we are looking, while the transatlantic alliance is becoming stronger because of this particular threat from Russia that they felt was there. We have seen weaponization of the financial instruments. That is something very new this time. And in our Indian context, we call it Brahmastra. So I think this Brahmastra has been launched by the Western countries, especially the United States, which is sitting far off, which is not dependent on oil and gas, which is not dependent on many things. Yet it is the Europeans, and the Russia considers itself as a part of Europe first, would move towards into the Asian bracket a little more in that sense. So what we are looking at, in my view, is that perhaps we are looking at a Cold War 2.0 scenario with a much, I would say, stronger vehemence of opposition and fight for technology, with Sino-Russian axis emerging very strong. In the Middle East, I always say a new kind of a scenario might evolve, that is Cryptarch, China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, Afghanistan. That kind of a grouping can emerge, and then the US-led other grouping. But it seems to me now, with this war, which was not expected so soon by anybody, I think that these kind of alliances might become. Where does India stand in that? I think in India today, again, is at the crossroads as it was in 1947. India does not like the word alliance. So I have been propagating, and today, 90% of the countries in the Middle East, in Africa, I've spoken to a lot of African ambassadors and even my friends from different political spectrum and different parts of the world. And they say that we don't want to be part of this Cold War game. We don't want to be a part of this superpower rivalries. It's not a question. Everybody hates this humanitarian catastrophe, which is unfolding now today. But at the same time, nobody wants to become a screw in this square peg. So I believe that India has yet again a possibility, and I hope we take action. We have talked to Zelensky, Putin, and all kinds of leaders at every time during this period, that India could have done a little more, in my view. Well, it is for the leadership to decide what they want to do. But henceforth, going forward, I think we should try to work on something called Nations for Strategic Autonomy, NSA, a new kind of thing. We must think about what we are. And I want to tell people here in this, those who are attending, that India is no longer the India of 1947 when it led from the front. It was weak. It had come out of colonialism. There was a cause of anti-colonialism. That was there. Today, it is a cause of strategic autonomy. Multi-alignments are fine with that. But at the same time, what India can do is, you are the second largest population in the world. You are the second biggest market in the world. You are the 1/6 of the population in the world. You have biggest market in the world, even for those defense people, because 90% of the time, the wars are driven by the defense lobbies in these countries. So I think that we have a possibility, and a very large number of countries will support that venture, and then we'll be able to wait through. I'll stop here. And now I'd like to invite a very distinguished professor who has also been involved with UN matters, especially in the nuclear field. And we have heard the unspeakable has been spoken about the nuclear arms and use of those. Threats have been somehow flagged. So Dr. Sidhu, early morning, good morning, very good morning to you. Now the floor is yours. Please 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll request Ambassador Svane to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Trigunayat. I was actually assuming that I would come in a little later, but I'm happy to go now, and I certainly won't go for 15 minutes. I'll be much shorter than that. I think my brief was to really talk about this from two perspectives. One, in some ways, from the perspective of the United States, and second, from the perspective, if you like, of obviously US-India relations as well. And the abstention is one part of that, but obviously there's a wider, bigger geopolitical dimension and dynamics to that. I mean, broadly speaking, I think for most countries, there are, if you like, three lenses through which they look at any kind of global commitment or interaction, including the kind of military operations that we're talking about. The first is obviously national interest. And in the sense of trying to promote and advance your own security, your own interests, that has been a very primary sort of driver for many countries. In fact, one would argue almost every country as well. Second, I think there's also this element of wanting to preserve the rule-based order, which happens to be, Western liberal in its connotation, but very much a preservation of that. So this is something that you might sort of call, wars or conflicts of value. The third is, of course, the element of humanitarian dynamics, which very much drives this kind of thinking as well. Now, obviously, there's a hierarchy among them, but if there's a convergence between these three lenses, that's when you sort of see a greater sort of domestic and other support for that action. And here, obviously, in the case of the United States, the invasion of Ukraine, as your title says, it really does kind of cover all three of those lenses. It is in the US national interest. It is a humanitarian issue, as Ambassador you mentioned as well. And it does challenge, frankly, the UN Charter. Article 2.4, this is a blatant violation of that. Of course, we know this is not the first, permanent member of the UN Security Council to violate the Charter in that sense. Unfortunately, it's probably not the last. But that in no way absolves this particular action of Russia. And I think that is the kind of context that we need to think about it, and where the United States is very much coming, into this discussion as well. Mind you, this is not something that the US was very keen on at all, and that's why I think very unusually, and I'm sure General Chakravorty will talk to this a little bit further as well, the amount of intelligence that they shared in trying to prevent this conflict was really exceptional. It actually made a lot of people in the Pentagon very uncomfortable as to the number of kind of weapons and equipment which was being deployed, both on the side of the United States and NATO, but also on the Russian side as well, essentially saying, look, we know exactly what you're doing. And so, this was not going to be a Crimea 2.0. Where it was really by stealth and, all the little green men and all of that idea, but none of that, sort of came through as well. Now, against that context, let me sort of then turn in some ways to and before I turn to the abstention issue, I also just want to, in some ways sort of flag from the Indian perspective, if you like, that not of its own choice or wanting, Soviet and Russian actions have sometimes put India in very much of a bind. Think, for example, about Afghanistan. is another instance that you had India being put in a very awkward situation. And Ambassador, you're absolutely right in pointing out how India tried very, maybe not overtly, but certainly covertly to raise that issue. But there was a more fundamental issue there as well. And this in some ways links up to the idea that you had of the, nations for strategic autonomy, and, which I'll come to in just a minute as well. From 1979 onwards, and then again, this was repeated when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and suddenly, and again, I'm sure Mr. Arun and General Chakravorty will talk to this, how there was a big quandary about trying to ensure the weapon supplies, particularly from the former Soviet Union, and the whole discussion and debate with Ukraine as well. But the point I want to make is that during that time, if you recall, India very consciously and very deliberately tried to get out of an all-Soviet equipment setting. And during the 1980s in particular, you saw India going out on a shopping spree, particularly to Europe, picking up aircraft carrier and aircraft from the United Kingdom, submarines from Germany, guns from Sweden, French aircraft, Italian torpedoes, and you name it, right? I mean, and this was really to try and create a degree of autonomy, if you like, of flexibility, so that all your eggs are not in, at that point of time, the Soviet basket. That, of course, also led in some ways, I would argue, to the economic reforms in 1991, because this spree led to, a certain degree of, outflow, which India was not in a position to pay right away. So I put that in the context of sort of saying, perhaps this again provides India an opportunity to think about diversification, because that is what would really kind of underline this element of autonomy as well. This then brings me to your central question, and I promise I'll keep quiet after that, is the issue of abstention. I think there are two aspects to the abstention. The first is the way that it has come across, in the sense that it is almost being seen as a negative vote, whereas in a way, abstention is really much more neutral. And the key element of the abstention is it did not prevent any of those resolutions going forward. It in no way sort of stopped that the General Assembly resolution as well, even though there was an abstention there. However, that being said, and I think the explanation of vote does a decent job of trying to provide some of the Indian nuances. But that being said, the US polity, very much like the Indian polity, is not always given to nuances. And again, I think you can see this playing out in two sort of ways. In the administration, let me back up a little bit, because I think, as you rightly said, US-India relations have been on an upward trajectory. Really since the end of 1991 and well beyond that as well. The only thing which is determined by the administration of the day is the pace of that trajectory. But otherwise, it is very much going in one direction. That being said, I think you now also see a deepening of India's kind of relationship with the United States, which goes beyond just the establishment, and by which I mean the government. There are at least three actors that India needs to think about. Number one is, if you like, the government, and I'll come to that in a minute. Second, the corporate sector. And third, the diaspora. By which I mean the American Indians, if you like, or Indian Americans, who are now increasingly playing a significant role here as well. On the government front, I think while there is a much better understanding on the part of the administration of India's position, which is why you saw that even in the emergency Quad meeting, which was called just in the beginning of March, India was not forced or put into a corner, on its position of, not supporting the rule-based law or the rule-based order in Europe while wanting to support it in the Indo-Pacific. That nuance was understood and appreciated. I think, but that is, the challenge is going to be in the Congress. Because in the Congress is where you have a lot of people, and we saw this particularly also in the case vis-a-vis India's position on Iran, and the same sort of situation, if you like, is going to be the case in Ukraine as well. I think India is going to come under much greater scrutiny on the part of its abstention, particularly for the kind of exemptions it's seeking for military equipment from Russia, and in particular, the S-400. And I think that's really going to be, a critical kind of element for India's own sort of security and the geopolitics as well. And how India, traverses that, I think is going to be a real sort of challenge. Let me end, if I might, by picking up a point you talked about, Ambassador, in how India might sort of play a role in this unfolding scenario. One element, I think, which hasn't been recognized, and I'm glad you picked it up, is the non-aligned element. As you saw in the General Assembly vote, there were 35 abstentions. That is an incredibly high number of abstentions. And those abstentions are both problematic for the Russians, because many of Russia's so-called allies chose to abstain rather than support it, which is very, if you're sitting in Moscow, very worrying. But at the same time, I think there's also this recognition that there are countries which don't want to be caught in this imbroglio going forward as well, because of the development dynamics and dimension there as well. And I think there certainly India has a role to play and something that it should build up. But so far, we have seen that India has been missing in action. You've seen Turkey play a role. You have seen, of course, China being talked about as one sort of go-between. Even Israel has been talked about. But India, apart from sort of obviously looking after the interests of its own citizens, which is absolutely paramount, has probably not done as much as it could. So it's talking the talk of dialogue, which I completely agree with, but it hasn't walked that walk yet. Let me stop there, Ambassador. There's much more to cover, but I'll leave it for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sidhu, for pointing out many things. Even I agree on this. Perhaps we could have done much more, been a little more proactive, what we stood for. That is something, but we'll discuss that. But now that we know that Ambassador Svane has to go for some meeting and he's already in the car. So I'll request Ambassador to please take the floor and share your thoughts.
I take the wheel, dear friends, and dear Anil. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. I think it's a very, very important juncture in the new world order, but it's also a very important juncture for humanity and, of course, for all the democracies around the world. Anil, you really touched upon, I think, two very, very important aspects. One being geopolitics and geoeconomics. And I think these two things are joined as well as separated will play a huge role in the future. And we have also seen that the aggression of Russia, which we have condemned from EU very, very strongly, that this will lead to a new world order, definitely. But we also seen that Europe has changed overnight. What we have been discussing, some have been hoping for many, many years, in fact, happened over just the night, so to say. 24/7, Europe changed its equation, so to say. There are no more any fractures to be seen within the European Union and in Europe as such. NATO is much more cemented than before, and the transatlantic relationship has really also changed dramatically. So what we are now facing is a totally united Europe and US, and add to that a lot of countries, Japan as an example, Australia as another example. So I think we will see a world order which is very, very different, but also challenging for rest of the world, so to say. I think we all know the reason why India abstained, and I'm not here and will not. I have never really criticized India. Of course, we had our expectations, and that's I think very, very important to have expectations. And India is always highlighting the democratic values, the rule of law, multilateralism, and all that. I think that's a recipe for a future growth that will also create a better platform for India. But India has its history, India has its legacy, and so forth. And I would also like to join the calls that India could have done more. But of course, it's up to the leadership out here to define what kind of role India will take. Of course, everybody will look into to serve its nationals, and of course, India had to evacuate and get all these 20,000 students out of Ukraine. It goes without saying, everybody is doing that and should be doing that. But in the longer run, I think we have to look into what are the trends of the situation that we have seen emerging. It goes without saying that Russia is much more isolated than ever before, and perhaps some of the contacts that they were looking into before making that kind of decision, they had not the slightest idea of how Europe would act and how US will act, how Japan will, and so forth. So that's a new equation emerging here. The other part is, of course, who will benefit in a larger picture from this conflict, and hopefully it will end sooner rather than later. But you have a big neighbor very close to you, and how will they be placed here? How are they evaluating the situation, and so forth? And some will be arguing that what we have seen, Russia and China might find a stronger kind of coherence. Will that be a comfort to India? Will that be a comfort to the rest of the world? I'm not so sure. And therefore, India will have to make a call one way or another where they see themselves. I have noticed with great interest how your foreign minister, he placed himself in the Quad foreign ministers meet and so forth, talking about what is within the geography of Quad and so forth. I think it's understandable and so forth, but the context for all of us has changed dramatically for all the European countries, for US, but also for India. The context is no longer what it used to be, whether it was from 47 onwards and even 10 years ago and so forth. So the demands being put upon the democracies of the world has changed drastically. And I think, of course, India, the Indian way is an important way, but it cannot just be how it was early on, because the context at that time was very different. Today, it's really a different context. And India is really aiming for this $5 trillion economy. So that's a big issue. How will you reach to that level of an economy? How will you do the green transition and all that? So basically, my conclusion, my private conclusion is that dependencies will have to be reduced to also to be loyal to your own strategy, namely what you could call the Indian way. So India will have to define much more clearly, much more strategically its own interests and navigating not with words, but with acts and actions. So that's how I see it. But no doubt Europe stands united, US stands united, Japan, all these countries will stand united. And of course, the number of countries abstaining within the UN, of course, it's a high number. But if you look into democracies, how many democracies abstain, then the numbers are very, very small. And perhaps there's also a kind of wake-up call. Where do you place yourself? But, you know, I'm not here to tell India what to do. I'm, of course, understanding the context of India. But today's world with a very, very interconnected geopolitical situation, geoeconomical situation, will leave less space to navigate as one did 20 years ago, 30 years, 40 years ago. So the world has changed and will be much more demanding. And I took some interest in the wording of your Honorable Prime Minister in Gujarat, both in Hindi and Urdu. He mentioned war. So at least your Honorable Prime Minister is seeing the situation in Ukraine as a war. And war has never produced anything but sufferings and losses and so forth. So I think your Prime Minister has now correctly understood the situation. But it's up to India to define what kind of role you would like to pursue. And I'm not to criticize anybody here, but context has changed, and India will also have to take a strong look into the new context and where to be placed in the future. If Russia, China is getting closer and closer, where will India then position yourself? So I think that's what I can say from the car still running on the wheels. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, ambassadors.
Thank you.
Very, very succinct comments and very apt. And I fully agree with you that Prime Minister Modi, even in his first discussion, when he spoke to President Putin, he very clearly told him to cease the hostilities and return to the table. And in fact, many people have not, but as diplomats, we know when you see the explanation of vote, you have to see what is not mentioned rather than what is mentioned. And so you have to read between the lines, and the Russians very clearly understood what India meant by that. And I have always said it that I tell you one small example. When I was in Libya, at that time, we had abstained against the NATO intervention in Libya, which was supposed to be right to protect. And of course, there are previous examples in Iraq where the credibility of the Western countries were at stake, and millions of people have died in that process. So at that time, I know that how the narrative was created that India was with Gaddafi just because we said we oppose the external intervention, military intervention. So this is also that's why I'm saying this is probably the first full-scale, full-fledged war which is taking place where the Americans have an edge of sorts, that they have weaponized their financial architecture to this extent that Russia will be cornered, no doubt. It will be terribly affected, but so will the rest of the world. And how long the Europeans in the near term take it, that will decide exactly the way things are going to move. Well, thank you so much once again, Ambassador. You've taken so your time. So kind of you to have joined us. Now I'll request Major General Dr. D.K. Chakravorty. So I think he's more of doctor because he's a strategist, a very well-known strategist. Sir, please share your thoughts as to how you see this war panning out, and do you see that the Russia has actually overstretched itself rather than, or its calculations have not been gone the way they wished it from a strategist point of view? Floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Ambassador Trigunayat, and thank you so much, Professor Sidhu, and also thank Ambassador Svane for his comments. All that I would say, I am in agreement with all of you. Military people certainly don't like wars, and I think we agree with you that after all, we don't like wars. But as I'll quote Clausewitz, since Ambassador belongs to Europe, war is a continuation of politics, political dimension by other means. So it's not something which is, that anybody likes or does not want or want. It is something which is done. And all the definitions of war, even if you, Ambassador Trigunayat spoke of hybrid war, they don't emanate in India. They don't emanate in Russia. They don't emanate in China. Professor Sidhu, they emanate in the United States. I have been contesting these definitions. I've been meeting all generals from all countries, China, Russia, you name it, United States, UK, the NATO, and been meeting them. And I must share with you that all of us look at things in the same way. Firstly, let me be clear, about this issue about Professor Sidhu saying that we haven't tried to open up our Soviet basket. Personally, I have been involved deeply with the United States. We got the NTPQ 37. I know how difficult it is to deal with the United States. The US feels, that India doesn't do too much. I remember even telling the Indian embassy in US how difficult it is. We got the ultralight howitzers. We had a conference in the US embassy in New Delhi. There were 37 people from so many countries of the US taking part. When you deal with Russia, you have one agency, you have one place, you have the Indian embassy in Moscow, you have a Rosoboron expert, and sometimes you don't have it, like in the case of BrahMos missiles. I'm giving you clearly. And you can get it through. With the US, you have people have come and told me, don't expect technology from the United States. Americans have told us, please get it from Russia. Where do we go? Please, we'll talk about the war, which is a very easy thing for me. Where do we get a nuclear submarine? Where do we get today our space sector going? Where do we get everything? Yes, Americans have given us a P-8I. They were supposed to give us the Guardian, what you call UAV. Now again, the Predator. These are issues under deep control. Very easy to say. You want even a tire from the United States. We had to get tires for the NTPQ 37. Believe me, I told the American general who visited, this is utterly shameful. This is an American talking about American procedures. I know all your procedures backwards. Ultimately, I put my own Jeep tires, which we make in India. We have to use the Ludhiana tactics for the US equipment. And it works very well for European equipment. I'm trained in Europe. I'm trained in Sweden, got the Bofors gun. So I know Europe very well. I know the United States a bit too well. Possibly many Americans don't know how the United States procedures are. I just tell you, I heard President Trump, he was a former president. He must have been elected by majority of the people. Many say the Russians have manipulated the United States. I think it's really credible if Russia can still, even now, I heard CNN only yesterday and they said, the way Russia could manipulate 2016 in the United States. I think if they could do that, then something is wrong with all of us. Well, coming on to it, India has done its best. And let me put it very, very clearly. We have got strategic autonomy, which Ambassador Trigunayat has very, very correctly described. I wouldn't like to go into further details. We look at the situation that the war must cease, and it should do it. Now, what did the Russians do? Well, the Russians are not fighting the war today. I'm just saying, as a military analyst, war started in December 1991, 25th December 1991. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, the war has started. So how many years now? 31 years. Let's take one by one the event specific to Ukraine. We will not go here and there. First was the Black Sea Fleet lay in Crimea. Without the Black Sea Fleet, today Russia does not have warm waters. So what did Boris Yeltsin do? He declared that the Black Sea Fleet is a part of Russia. Ukraine accepted it. Next comes the most important decision which took place in 1994. There were nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They were removed by Russia. So 1994 is the next turning point. And then comes, 2015, where today, without a shot being fired, General Gerasimov, who continues to be the Chief of General Staff, from 2012, I don't think any general has continued into service from 2012, and today is 2022. He applied the Gerasimov doctrine, and you had today Crimea. I mean, when you're talking of Crimea, I'm talking of Sevastopol, and I'll not name all the details of the places coming into you. And then in April, the Donbass region comes in. Well, this is the way it has been developing. And then you have had what you call the elections over there, and you have had these regions coming. Then you have had the Russian army going in. They have been triggering. So are everybody doing. Today, I just now received a WhatsApp that 250,000 hackers from the West are working to ensure that there are false pictures coming to me. I'm just giving you may be feeling Russia is achieving nothing. So let's take on all these issues in a little, possibly in a more correct perspective. Why does Russia need? Putin said one thing. There will be no war if Ukraine does not join NATO. I'm repeating it. He has said it many times. If today Ukraine doesn't join NATO, there's no war. And then obviously you keep changing goalposts. He made it, they should not join the European Union and all this. So when you don't do it, well, he started with initial objectives, pronounced objectives as Donbass. Definitely, Donbass will not yield him that NATO objective. So he started 4 offensives, which you all know, one heading from Belarus onto Kyiv, the second going on to Kharkiv, the third going on to Donbass, and the 4th is coming from the south from Crimea. What was his aim? The aim was to make the political leadership realize that there is no point of going with the West. Today, you have Zelensky himself saying, there is no place for us in NATO. I have heard him myself. Now again, you'll say that he may not have said it, somebody else has said it. Now, well, it's very difficult to say who is saying what and who is not talking what. Since we belong to the military, we know who speaks the truth and who does not speak the truth. And generally, it is very difficult to know who is speaking the truth. But the fact remains that today, at least, they are meeting at Antalya, which is in Turkey, and they have had the first round. The second round is also possibly going to take place. And you'll soon see what has happened militarily. Let's get the situation right. If you look at it, Russian military objectives have already been achieved. What have they got to do now? They have to win at the peace table. When you have to win at that table, which is in Turkey, all right, and don't forget, Turkey may be a part that you're feeling very happy. Europe is united, America is united. Believe me, I see a number of channels of the United States, Sidhu sir, and with due respect, there are contradicting remarks in each channel. You see Fox, you see CNN, believe me or not, it looks like as if they are channels of 2 separate countries. The Democrat view is one, the Republican view is not totally what a few senators from the Republican are saying or a few House reps are saying. You know what Trump is saying from Mar-a-Lago and Florida. If you want, I've got the statements in writing. And he's still saying Putin is a nice man. I do not know. He was the former president. He still provided security by the United States of America. And then you are calling Putin a dictator. You have supported so many dictators. The United States, I can name you so many dictators have been supported. Well, I am not a diplomat, and certainly I don't want to extend the war on the television screen. But certainly I would like to say, I was posted in Vietnam. And with the American defense attaché, because I was a very important man in Vietnam, I was posted from 1996 to 1999. We even bought bread from Bangkok. So I know what sanctions are. But believe me, if you think that sanctions are going to kill a nation, sanctions are going, believe me or not, India also has been under sanctions. I don't know if some sanctions are still continuing for India. I once checked up, and as much as 3 years back, there were certain sanctions which were still continuing, which I brought it to the attention of the government. Being a retired person, it was easier to do it because you went through the websites. So US sanctions, European, by the way, Europe has not yet put any sanctions on gas, or they have not put any sanctions on petrol, because the day you do it, Europe collapses. So what are we talking about, the so-called United Alliances and other things? Was Trump somebody who was not elected by the United States? Even now, when I play golf with people who have come from Americans in New Delhi, many of them are still feel that the Trump policies were good. When I go to the United States, I still find a large section of people who still believe, and even if you take the voting which took place, a fair amount voted for Trump. It is not that it has been a majority which you can see. So even the US is concerned, as far as European nations are concerned, why is Macron talking to Putin? Why is the German Chancellor talking to Putin? And what is Putin doing? I think out of all the leaders, possibly militarily, the most calibrated is Putin. Let me put it to you militarily. You ask anybody, let me see one military person who says that he has achieved nothing. Let me see, yes, I agree, there is no air superiority. I agree there is no favorable air situation. I agree that Turkey has supplied certain UCAVs, which are doing a great job in today taking on Russian convoys. But by and large, lot of restraint is being shown by the Russians. Let me put it to you. Imagine today 2.1 million Ukrainians have been able to go safely out of the country. It's only yesterday that they have started dealing with Lviv. I think the best answer is, which I look at, I don't hear any channel. What, having served in an Indian embassy, what is the location of the Indian embassy today? It's in Poland. It was first in Kiev. From Kiev, it moved to Lviv. And today it's in Poland. Why the Indian embassy, Ambassador Trigunayat is sitting here, let me tell you, I have been a part, and I remember in Cambodia, things, nobody allows you to evacuate unless things are really bad. So situation, as it stands today, you have Kiev, which is contained, reaching isolation. These are military terms I'm using now. Kharkiv is almost isolated. As far as the Mariupol is concerned, it's isolated, could lead to investment, leading to capture. Possibly they don't want to capture all this. I'm sharing with you now. Certainly not interested. They want two assurances. They don't want NATO at their door. Now you all spoke about Quad. Is it very happy if today China comes and sits in Sri Lanka? Or China comes and sits even in Myanmar? Is it acceptable to me military? Is it acceptable that they come and sit in Nepal? Is it acceptable that they even come and sit in Gwadar? We are not accepting it. So how do you expect Russia when today itself, in 1991, one of the major issues which Gorbachev brought out is NATO should not come in. Now, all East European countries have joined NATO. All East European, Poland, Latvia. I mean to say, what strengths do they have? What is their capability? How many can fight? The last war they have fought is the Second World War. How much time did it take for Hitler to capture Poland? Please go through history. All of you know history better than me. How much time did it take for all these republics to keep changing from side to side? I still remember visiting St. Petersburg, and I was told very clearly that Finland was, given to this thing. 3 people who have attacked Russia till today. One was obviously Sweden. Second was France, that is Napoleon. And the third, obviously, it was the Germans. I don't think anybody, you can have NATO united. So what? What are you going to do? Can you use nuclear weapons? The answer is no. Can you use your aircraft? The answer is no. So therefore, you have to understand that you have to accommodate Russia, as I think Ambassador Trigunayat rightly called, one is a hyperpower and the other is a superpower. With so many nuclear weapons, with all the devices, you can't say that just by not giving economy. Fine, today the dollar is powerful. Tomorrow you'll have the yuan taking its place. You'll say that's not practicable. Wall Street can't be replaced. Okay, and you can't today. What happens? I mean to say, okay, next you'll say, well, India, is it acceptable to India that Russia and China comes close? Well, India has a very fine way of dealing with many people. I think, Sidhu sir, you belong to India, at least you understand, you got Punjabis who possibly can't speak when they go to South India even today. So we know how to deal with countries. Our diversity is something. I have been posted all over India. I've just returned from the Jammu and Kashmir. All right, I am a Bengali. I have been posted all over India. I've been posted at many places in the world. Indians know how to adjust with everybody. We can adjust with China. We know how to deal with China. It's not that we are what you call going to suddenly occupy Tibet. Or no, not at all. But we know how to show them their place. Otherwise, why did China have the 15th round of conference of the Corps commanders just on Friday? Today is Monday. The next point which I want to bring, where will all this end? Any military campaign must have an end state. What does America want? Do they have an end state? What does the NATO have? Does it have an end state? That this is what we should end it? You want a ceasefire, Putin would like an end state. What is the end state? End state can't be ending sanctions. Everybody knows that the sanctions will never end. We have to live with sanctions. This is a part, sir. These are all hard people. Russians are very, very, you have to read books, and you have to go and see Russia, how they can live on what you call crumbs if required in that cold winter. But the point is, we have got to see as to the end state which Russia wants in this case is very simple, one point. Ukraine should not join NATO. And I think it's a very good point. If Ukraine joins NATO, I'm afraid the world will cease to exist. I deal with weapons. I deal with missiles. I deal with nuclear weapons. I do agree these are political weapons, but politicians don't handle the weapons. Diplomats don't handle the weapons. Professors don't handle the weapons. Journalists don't handle the weapons. We handle them. And often there could be accidents. I mean, there's an open fact that we, at least on 5 occasions, very rightly or wrongly, nuclear weapons could have been used by the Soviet Union or the United States. We know it. So would you like them to sit next to each other, have the NATO hugging what you call the western borders of Russia, and see that the world doesn't exist? Is it something we are wishing? Certainly, if you say India is abstaining, I think India's had the common sense to do it. And you might say that India is looking for what, a 5 trillion. It will come to us. If we work hard, we will get it.
Yeah.
Today, as far as Vietnam is concerned, you watch it. I was posted to Vietnam for 3 years. Today, Vietnam is growing at the speed of what you call better than any Asian economy. Bangladesh is growing. It is not dependent on the United States of America, and the US will come to India. I have seen what happens. Having bought weapons from you, tires from you, radars from you, and also guns from you, which are deployed today by us, and we are grateful to you. And everybody telling me they will not fire Indian ammunition, our men will get killed. They are now firing Indian ammunition. We have made them do what we wanted them to do. So therefore, having told you, I would like to just say over here, the end state has possibly been reached by Russia. It is now at the peace table, and we hope that things would improve. So I would like to rest my case over here, and we'd like to continue. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, General Chakravorty, for that very passionate and fact-ridden speech of yours. And many of the points I fully agree with you. And if we know the history of Russia and the Russian people, I would say I would not talk about the czars and the Soviet leaders and others, but the people of Russia are very different than anywhere else in the world. And the Ukrainians, I would count them in the same breath. But now we have to touch upon something that we have really not touched upon, and that is on the economic impact, global impact of these sanctions and this war. And since Mr. Arun is not only a journalist, but also a noted economist, I would request him to touch upon these things and how India can confront these secondary, tertiary sanctions that are likely to come, and which Professor Sidhu also mentioned about TATSA and others. So floor is yours, Mr. Arun.
Yeah, thank you. Before I come to discuss the economic impact, let me just add one opinion in support of what Professor Chakravorty said, Dr. Chakravorty said. India's stance is not guided by its legacy or past relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union. It is guided by the future. Does India want a world where Russia is sidelined, marginalized, ceases to be a geopolitical power center? And do you want the world to be divided between the US with China as our other hegemon? When the world was divided between 2 camps between the US and the Soviet Union, India could play one side off against the other and get concessions on both. That option is not available when one of the 2 hegemons is China, who's your border, which sits across the border to the north and is trying to put pressure on your territory. Then you will be completely under the thumb of the US if you want to resist China's pressure. That goes against the very root of India's policy of having strategic autonomy. It is in India's interest for Russia to continue as a viable geopolitical power center. And that is one major reason that motivates India to act in the way that it has. Now, even if the war ends tomorrow, there are serious economic implications that have already been caused, unleashed, and which will not go back into the bottle like any genie which can be called back. Oil prices have surged, gas prices have surged, wheat and oilseed prices have gone up. And these are things which cannot suddenly reverse. The next sowing of wheat in Ukraine and Russia, in Ukraine basically, not Russia so much, has been affected. And which means there will be a shortage of wheat for the foreseeable next 6-7 months. And that will have its own implication for food prices. This comes at a time when the world is seeing heightened inflation as a result of COVID-related supply bottlenecks. And these pressures will increase the tendency for prices to stay up and keep rising. Whenever there is any uncertainty in the global economy, there is a flight to safety of globally deployed capital. We have seen that in the Indian stock market. The FIIs, the foreign portfolio investors, have dumped their investments in Indian stocks and Indian debt, and they have gone back to their home countries. This puts pressure on our exchange rate. The rupee has depreciated. Yes, we have some reserves with the RBI with which we can try to smoothen out the fluctuation in the value of the rupee, but it does create a strain on the system. When the RBI intervenes to stabilize the rupee and it sells dollars, then it is actually creating an additional liquidity shortage. When it sells dollars, it is actually sucking up rupees. When the money supply goes down, it tends to put upward pressure on interest rates. So we are witnessing a higher yield without the RBI changing its basic monetary policy stance. And that is not very good for India at a time when the economic recovery is still very nascent, incipient. And so these are all consequences that have been created by the war in the short term. But there are longer term implications as well. The weaponization of the dollar that we saw with Iran already had created problems even for the Europe. Europe had wanted to buy oil from Iran because they were part of the Iran nuclear deal, and they were not very happy when Trump walked out of it unilaterally. But because of the ability of the United States to use the dollar as leverage against all other countries in the world, they got away with it. But now China and Russia will collaborate in creating an alternate payment mechanism. Now, this payment mechanism is not just a politically created contrivance. The Bank for International Settlements has, through its innovation lab, already created a blockchain-based international cross-border payment system, which is independent of the dollar. Now, there will be additional impetus to these kinds of new technological blockchain-based cross-border payments, which will greatly reduce the ability of the US to weaponize the dollar. And this is something that will get added impetus thanks to what has happened in the wake of the Ukraine war and the sanctions that has been imposed. I do not think that the US will declare secondary sanctions. They have declared sanctions, yes, but secondary sanctions, which says that any entity that deals with a sanctioned entity in Russia will face the same sanctions as the entity in Russia has faced. That's not going to happen because Europe needs to buy gas and oil from Russia. If you sanction every bank in Russia, then who does Europe make payments to? It cannot. So you cannot sanction every bank in Russia. So, and for the same reason, you cannot have secondary sanctions. Because if you declare blanket secondary sanctions, again, the result will be to cut off all means of settling payments for the gas they buy for Europe from Russia. And Europe just cannot afford to do that. So right now, there are no prospects of secondary sanctions. And India should be happily willing to buy Russian oil. We should be happily willing to sell them whatever produce they need. I would say that we should also be willing to settle Russia's external payment obligations. We actually run a current account deficit, which means we have to pay Russians money. That money, instead of paying directly to Russians, through a simple change in procedural rules, the RBI can ask Indian importers to settle their dues with whoever Russia has to settle make their payments to. So that is something that is entirely possible to. And we will not face any sanctions from the US because of this, because there are no secondary sanctions. Another big change that is going to happen, that every country in the world is going to increase their arms expenditure. Every country. Germany has already said it will raise its defense budget to 2% of GDP. And it has lost its historic defensiveness on defense. It is exporting arms to many countries, now exporting arms to Ukraine also. South Korea has become an exporter of weapons. Japan very clearly sees that the US will talk the talk, but will not necessarily walk the talk. And therefore, it is going to become more self-reliant for its own defense, which means we should be prepared to see a change in the Japanese constitution, which Abe tried to carry out but didn't succeed. But now the material pressure is much more on Japan to do that and come out openly as a normal country with its defense capability not trammeled by external obligations. If Japan becomes more normal in terms of its defense capability, you cannot expect to see Korea sitting behind and not doing what is required to be done for its own defense. So we are going to see an increased military outlays by countries across the world. Now, this means there will be cut back in the money that is required for a great many other things, which will have its own implications for economic activity, for the kind of goods that are produced, the kind of money they have available to spare on various other things, and that will have its own implications. Another area is energy. Now, Europe wants to structurally liberate itself from dependence on Russian oil and gas. The only way they can do that is by accelerating the green transition. Already they have been planning to decarbonize economies and move away from dependence on gas. So I would think that there will be a greater investment in nuclear energy. The small modular reactors of fusion energy that have been talked about, that technology is being made more perfect. Germany will reverse its policy of not using nuclear power to meet its energy requirements. So we will see a big resurgence in nuclear power. We will see even nuclear fusion, in which some major advance was made earlier this year. That will also probably be reach increasingly commercial possibilities. And these are things that both pose an opportunity and a challenge to India. So India cannot lag behind when the rest of the world is moving ahead on these technological fronts in the way energy is produced and consumed. And it is high time, I would think, that India started going beyond its pilot project on our domestically sourced thorium-based fast breeder reactors and made bold to accelerate that program. Now, the US has sanctioned Russian oil, but the US is a major importer of Russian uranium. They haven't put any brakes on that. Now, I think that the nuclear energy is going to only increase in global importance. And India should also be part of that activity. And we should also step up our own research and our own capability in producing nuclear energy. So in all these areas, we are going to see a major shift, even if the peace talks succeed and the war in Ukraine comes to an end day after tomorrow. And I hope it does. Nobody is in favor of war. But after Germany attacked Poland, was it really feasible for other countries in Europe to say, oh no, war is such a bad thing, we should sit on our hands and look on as Germany goes around conquering the rest of the world? So some wars are thrust upon people, and sometimes wars will not be fought. That is why we have armies and we prepare for action. And it is in India's interest for the world to be multipolar and not to be bipolar. And it is in India's interest for Russia to continue as a viable center of geopolitical power. And thanks to what the US has done from Trump's time, and the unilateralism that Biden has shown in declaring sanctions against Russia in terms of oil, and earlier the way they had edged out France from the submarine deal with Australia, Europe is going to create its own geopolitical force. It will try to create its own identity outside NATO. And we will see one more center of global power coming up, that is Europe, which is separate from America. And I think India has to prepare to deal with all these major changes. And I'm sure we can do it. I don't think the major problem with India is that our media discourse is sort of informed by Western media and their commentary. And this, I think, creates some problem in having clarity as to what exactly is India's national interest in all these areas. And I think it is good that we have discussions like these to clarify these issues. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Arun, for that very profound analysis, and very hopeful. I had a lot of hope that there would be no secondary sanctions, but it depends on the way the war goes, actually, and how, in my view, Putin is going to play out. Because currently, one looks at the overall objective. If you were to look at it from the US deep state's perspective, is to denude Russia of its power, basically, even its superpower status.
Right.
Sending a message to the Chinese, who are an economic giant, to somehow that we have this kind of a financial power and we can cripple anyone and everybody. But I don't know who has miscalculated, whether it is the Western countries or whether it is Russia or China, because they have been working in quite a close nexus, not from now, but when Putin was there in January for the Beijing Olympics as a chief guest. At that time, such a huge document that they signed, and they have been working on creating new mechanisms which are countering SWIFT. Even the Europeans were fed up when the Iranian thing happened, you know that. And so I think that we are looking at a very different kind of a world now. I mean, and it's difficult to predict, but hopefully the countries like India will not face the economic sanctions, because unless the Americans wish to kill the goose, that is golden goose, I guess. Because as Professor Sidhu was mentioning, defense is very important. And as General Chakravorty also mentioned, it's difficult to get things from USA, because then they have the dual use, they have all kinds of restrictions, licensing and all that. I have served in Russia for 7 years, and I have served as trade commissioner in the US also. So I have seen both hands. And I know that it becomes increasingly difficult to deal with them, because then they want to keep all the eggs in their own hands. So this is something that sometimes causes a major problem in dealing with them. Now, of course, fortunately, we have signed all those 3 primary agreements and LEMOA and others. So interoperability is becoming far more important and useful. And I believe that that is something that will go long. And from the discussions which are held in this Quad Summit, and bilaterally that Jaishankar has been talking to Blinken and elsewhere in Munich Security Conference and everywhere, I think that this has been very clearly mentioned to them. And I don't buy this, that we are only not doing anything or against Russia just because we have arms and ammunition from Russia. I mean, India has already now, if you were to go through the CIPRI yearbook last one, from 70%, we have reduced it to 43%. We are importing more than $20 billion worth from the United States. And also from Israel is our 3rd largest partner, France is coming in the middle, wanting to do the nuclear submarines and all kinds of things with us. But one thing so far, and Professor Sidhu can tell us better, the problem in the Indian establishment also is, at the public psyche, is that the trust for the Americans has been missing. That when you really need them, and I think that during this time, the Ukrainian message and from Ukraine, the message that goes to the world and those friends of USA is that when it comes to the brass tacks, you may not count on USA that much. We have seen in China, they are following exactly the same policy that India is doing, competition with cooperation. So I think that this is something we need to look at. Now, we have, I think, individually answered all the questions which are there in the Q&A. And Mr. Arun, you also have one question there for you. Rest, Professor Sidhu has answered. I have also written that. But I'll now, Professor Sidhu, maybe perhaps your closing comments, and then we will pass on to Dr. Mehta.
All right, thank you very much. I wasn't planning to, but I'm very happy to sort of jump in into the discussion. I think one thing hearing this discussion is very interesting. It raises two questions in my mind. Neither one of them, I feel very qualified to respond on my own, but certainly others on the panel might be able to do that. Number one, is India's objective of becoming a $5 trillion economy possible without globalization? Is it possible with the multipolarity that we've been talking about, or is it that the drivers of globalization are really some sort of parts of the country as well? The second idea of India, it also sounds like India is already, even if it does become a $5 trillion economy, has already relegated its position to that of a balancing power rather than a leading power. One that can never, in some ways, in its own mind, lead, that it will always need other countries to balance with or against. And I think that in some ways kind of, puts in the broader context of something that perhaps India needs to think about as well. I think just in the context of the United States, as I was saying, this is a multi-dimensional relationship. Government to government has only ever been one part of it. I think the diaspora is equally important, as indeed are the corporate sector. Also the fact that you actually have much greater emphasis here on the private sector, which is why you will have more companies bidding and challenging there as well, compared to state-owned enterprises, which are going forward. I think I'll make 2 points and kind of end with that. This question about the US support being lackluster. Maybe one thought experiment which might be interesting for us to do is look at the amount of statements supporting India's position against China on Galwan that came out over the last couple of years, and certainly in 2020, and compare that with the number of statements of support that came from Russia or any other country. And I think that might give you one kind of marker of how you might want to measure this element of support or lack of it there as well. The other element, I think, is that it's always much more challenging, particularly for the US, to do defense business in particular with non-allies. And this is something, which is very, very unique. And part of it is, of course, got to do with the alliance system, but also this understanding that India can never be part of the alliance system. But it's not just that aspect of it. It's also this concern about the transfer of technology and where it might end up. For example, would India be comfortable selling any of its advanced technology to a country knowing that it might land up in China or in Pakistan? And unless that's not possible, then I think, you know, there's a similar kind of logic which might be flowing out of the US here as well. Given all of these constraints, as Ambassador Trigunayat, you pointed out, I think this relationship, certainly on the security and the military front, between the US and India has gone much further and perhaps much faster than it may be comfortable for a lot of people to go. But I think it is the nature of this polity between the two that I think which is important as well. I just see one more brief comment, I think, which has come up. No, I don't actually. My apologies. But thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Professor Sidhu. That's exactly what you mentioned is correct to a great extent. But a few points, if I may add. You know, the transfer of technology is something that India has been insisting because of its long ago. Earlier, we used to call it self-reliance, import substitution mechanisms, and all that. And then Dr. Manmohan Singh, as you know, I used to be in New York at the time. We started economic reforms. And then today we are looking at something called Atmanirbhar Bharat, with by a different name, but with a different context. Because today India is trying to become a part of the global value supply chain through its own interdependencies, which it has identified during the pandemic vis-a-vis China. So India's biggest problem is not Russia, it's not US, it is China, which will remain its problem. Now, of course, USA made statements for India. Trump could say anything, whatever it is. But it was essentially in the context of their own geopolitical contestation with China, not necessarily for India. And this, as a strategist, you know it, that this is India figures prominently in their equation. So India has to leverage that. I mean, I'm saying simply, there are no friends, it's only national interests. So we have to look at that. Secondly, as far as Russia is concerned, it did not make any statement openly because it also has a very close strategic partnership and in the global context that serves its purpose with China. But what it did to you, Russia had at that time, when we needed any kind of arms equipments, we gave them a list of about 43 items. Our defense minister went there and they said, we will just give it to you. Giving S-400 to us, China is not happy. It's not only the US, China is also not happy that Russia is giving it to us. But the Russians have gone and given to us. Secondly, in 99 Kargil war, when I was there, I have seen it. No other country will help you the way the Russians will come up to Europe. Because, and I'm not going to talk about these here on this platform, but we have seen in practice the way they have come to. So that has generated a lot of, I think, the popular perception that you need a friend and the friend who can stand up for you. Of course, USA is, everybody says. So that's why in the beginning itself, I discounted the privileged strategic partnership with Russia and the global comprehensive, and coming to what India can do and should do. So thank you very much. That was very nice. And last few points, Dr. Mehta, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, sir. Professor Sidhu wants to respond.
Okay.
No, actually, not so much to this, although I think this is a very important point. Just to say that even in the US, in the India, Russia and Soviet relationship, there was never transfer of technology. They were very happy to sell, the goods and material, but this is one of the things which India was never able to crack, even with Russia and the Soviet Union before that. But I just wanted to pick up on two things. One, actually, from Professor Vijay Lakshmi, which I think is very important to keep in mind here as well, is the other dimensions of this war, which is really that it's also being fought out in social media and in reputational loss. And I think this is something that every country needs to keep in mind. going forward as to how, that's going to be an important role. And the last thing I'll sort of say, Ambassador, is something that you raised right in the beginning, is the weaponization of trade and finance. And I think this is the new reality that one will have to address with. It's not entirely new. For example, if you look at, how India is using the financial arrangements to counter some of Pakistan's actions as well, you can see that this is really becoming part of the new arsenal that others would also be using. And so, this old approach of just having surpluses is not going to be enough. But I think there's a more fundamental question as to how do you deal with this notion of globalization? Do you entirely jettison it and sort of, go back to just being isolated, and then, what was then called the Hindu rate of growth, etc., which has its own pros and cons? Or do you go ahead with globalization, recognizing that there are these additional risks as well? But thank you again very much.
Thank you, sir. Arun, sir, you have raised your hand. Sir, if you could also take this question on, the sanctions are increasing day by day against Russia. And just today we have one article by editorial by Professor Ashok Gulati on Ukraine to UP in the Indian Express. So could this mean somewhat a sort of a silver lining for the Indian economy in terms of food and other prices?
Yeah. I mean, that's a very straightforward answer. If there is a shortage of wheat, India has some huge amount of wheat in our stocks, 20 million tons or which are surplus, which India doesn't need. And India can easily sell them in the international market. So that's not such a big deal. Now, I want to say one reason why there will be no secondary sanctions is that if secondary sanctions are to be announced, they will be announced against China, not against just one company in China, but against the Chinese economy across the board. And this is not something that the world can afford. China's exports last year amounted to $3.6 trillion. $3.6 trillion is larger than India's GDP. That was China's exports. The world relies on China's exports to a large extent to keep its supply of consumer goods flowing, to contain inflation. If those goods are kept out, shut out, sanctioned out, then the world is going to see very, very difficult times. America is going to see very difficult times. Europe is going to face very difficult times. So that is why there will be no secondary sanctions. Second, Dr. Sidhu's point, there is no, choice, mutually exclusive choice between globalization and multipolarity. Even as the US and China were engaged in a trade war, China had opened up its financial markets to Western financial companies. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and such other companies were getting into asset management in Shanghai, even as the trade war was going on. So global finance is much more integrated today than they were in 2015. So just because there is strategic competition, it doesn't mean that economic integration cannot happen simultaneously. I can see very well that right now there is going to be technology nationalism. China is developing its own microelectronic technology, its own semiconductor industry, which the Americans are trying to put a ban on against sales to China. Now it has banned sales to Russia. Russia and China, both will try to develop their own advanced technology. So will India. If China today has mastery over quantum communications, India will be a fool if India doesn't try to reach there on its own. India will. So there will be technology nationalism. At the same time, at various other levels, the world will continue to grow ever more interdependent. The developed countries are going old. They have surplus savings, which need to be deployed where growth is, from where they can generate a return, and with that return, pay pensions. So the world will continue to globalize. And regardless of what happens at the strategic level, this is not the kind of world where Russia as the Soviet Union tried to present a separate economic paradigm. There is no separate economic paradigm now. Every country is capitalist. And they will continue to integrate, be interdependent financially, interdependent on trade on a whole lot of commodities which are non-strategic. And that kind of globalization will continue regardless of there being multipolarity and strategic competition between the different poles. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Major General, your final thoughts, if you'd like to share. Please unmute.
Okay. I think everything has been covered. I found a question that has already been answered. And it's regarding, the relation between how China has abstained and India has abstained. I think everybody has covered it. I will not get into further details. All that I would say is militarily, I don't think things are going to go further. It's up to the United States and Europe to decide how to continue giving all these anti-tank weapons and hot missiles and triggering the Ukrainians to do much more than, on one hand, you've got refugees going. Let's be very clear about it, 2.2 million refugees in 19 days. You look at Bangladesh, 6 months, how many refugees moved to India? Just calculate, I have got the figures with me. Which country has had 2.2 million refugees moving out of, this is not my figure. It is a figure given by the United Nations, not by Russia or something. So if 2.2 million are moving, and today itself, about 30,000 people are leaving Kyiv right now. So therefore, please, I would request, better sense must prevail. Don't have too much faith in countries like Latvia, Poland, Romania, that they can fight. They have never fought. Historically, if you have not fought, fighting is not something that we go to a school and you learn. It takes a long time for a nation to learn how to fight. You learn it the real hard way. There's no school for fighting. There's no academy. We taught the Afghans how to fight in our academies. They ran away. The US taught them, everybody taught them. So my view is we should stop encouraging all this. See the broader picture, which Ukraine is seeing. Let me tell you, their foreign minister, when they sat down at what you call Anatolia, you hear the views. I heard that conference, both sides. Even Putin said it's nice to see that even Zelensky said that the Russians, please let us not trigger this by declaring $200 million of anti-tank weapons. What are these anti-tank weapons going to do? Which one tank going, what difference does it make? Even 100 tanks being destroyed, what difference does it make? Could the US stop the Vietnamese tanks from entering Saigon? They had to run away in a helicopter. Could they stop the Taliban from entering Kabul? I'm just asking this to all of you. It's not to the United States. Please see the reality on the wall. If the Indian embassy has moved to Poland, please understand, Ambassador Trigunayat is sitting here, how difficult it is for an ambassador to move out of a country. We had Cambodia under trouble when Hun Sen was there. The Indian government doesn't give you permission to move out. Under all odds, till they ensure that sir will bear me out, and I was looking after it, till every Indian who is supposed to vacate that country is safely evacuated. So therefore, if the Indian embassy has moved to Poland, I think good sense must prevail, not in relying on what information is being fed through social media and all these, and making somebody a superpower and calling somebody names. Now, that's not the way things work. Weapons speak for themselves. An aircraft is a bigger aircraft. A fighter is a fighter. And please, I think that reality must dawn upon us. Let's give diplomacy a chance, which all of you have, I think, said, sir. Let's give them a chance. Let the Ukrainians and the Russians decide. And I think we should not keep encouraging $250 million aid of anti-tank weapons, hot missiles. These will make no difference. You have left $95 billion worth of equipment in Afghanistan. People don't even, I think they have become toys now, this $95 billion worth of economy. On one hand, the US is, people are crying that 79 cents per gallon, Sidhu sir will be able to tell us, is the increase in rate of petrol. Despite Biden releasing the study, 79 cents is the rise. So this is the way the US is suffering due to sanctions. Look at it. So I would like to say, please, we should, I think, now cool down, all of us, including myself, and I would like to thank and just end over here.
Thank you, Major General. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, your final words before we conclude.
Let's give diplomacy a chance, and that's it. The war must stop. And I hope both Putin and Zelensky are able to. Already there are some good, hopeful signs which are coming from both sides. So, as I said, that this is geopolitics. It is not a small war in that area. So it is much more at stake for everybody. And we'll see it in a few days' time how it plays out. But it's been unfortunate. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. So yes, this has truly been very enriching panel discussion, and I would like to just formally conclude with the formal vote of thanks. Before that, I would like to reiterate that IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies stands and unequivocally supports peaceful resolution of all disputes and calls for an immediate end to all violence. So on behalf of the center, I would like to propose the formal vote of thanks. My sincere gratitude to our esteemed panelists, Professor W.P.S. Sidhu, Major General P.K. Chakravorty, Mr. T.K. Arun, and to the chair of the session, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. Honorable Ambassador of the Royal Danish Embassy, Mr. Freddy Svane, we are privileged to have had your participation. I would also like to thank all our viewers, including representatives from different embassies, high commissions and consulates from India here on Zoom, and also all those who are watching us on Facebook Live. I also thank all those who would be watching the deliberation later on our YouTube channel or listening to the podcast on different platforms. Hope you will join us again in our future events. Thank you and wish you all a great rest of the day and week ahead. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye-bye.